pastored a number of years and was never aware of anyone in my church who struggled with homosexuality, and had no friends or relatives that I knew of who struggled with it. And as a pastor, most of what I said was harsh, negative, and condemning. And I didn't really think anything about it until once, when I had said some things in a sermon about homosexuality, I really sensed God convicting me. And in essence, I just seemed to hear God saying to me, if someone who struggled with that heard you preach, would they come to you for help? And I knew instantly they wouldn't. And it grieved me, because I consider myself a compassionate pastor, and I long to be with people in their struggles, to help them. But I'd never translated that to homosexuality. And as I thought about it, I sensed the Lord saying, well, if they did come to you, what would you tell them? And I said, well, I would tell them that Jesus could set them free. And then he said, well, then what would you say? And I realized I knew nothing to say beyond that. And not that that's not an adequate answer, but obviously for anybody who's dealt with any kind of addiction, you know there's much more involved. So I spent several months asking around, talking to other guys, trying to find out, how do you approach this? What do you do? How do you help people? And realized after a while that most of the guys I talked to didn't know any more than I did, but they just wouldn't say they didn't know. So they would tell me things, and I would think, no, that's not an answer. And finally, after several months of that, I ran across the name of a group called Exodus International, and I'd never heard of them, didn't know anything about them. So I tracked down an address for them, and I wrote to them and said, I feel like this is going to be a tremendous issue for the church in the coming generation. I think it could be a watershed issue for the church, and I realize I don't know anything about it, and I'd like some information. This was 95, and they sent me a packet of material, which was helpful, and within that packet was an invitation to their annual conference. And Bob Davies was the president at that time, the executive director. And I didn't know him, didn't know anybody. The only thing I knew in their brochure that they sent was that Dennis Jernigan was going to lead the worship. And but I had no intention of going. I thought, I'm not going to go spend a week on a college campus with gays, ex-gays, whatever. I'm not going to do that. And you know how when you tell God something like that, what generally happens. So in July of that year, I found myself in San Diego at the annual Exodus conference. And from the first day, it just radically altered my heart in so many ways. And actually, I probably would not have gone, but somehow my wife sensed my hesitancy and also sensed that I felt like I needed to go. And so she said, if you really want to go, I'll go with you. I said, you will? And she said, yeah. I said, okay. So the last day of registration, I sent my registration in. The very last day, actually the very last hour, I sent it in. And I wasn't sure they're going to accept it, because the deadline was that day, the day I mailed it. And they wanted me to send it Western Union or something, and I didn't do that. But they accepted it, and so we went. And it just, every session just profoundly moved me. I was not a weepy person. I was not that kind of person, but I rarely made it through a major session without tearing up. And I remember the worship was so intense, and I kept trying to put my finger on what was it that made this worship so different. And I thought it probably was Dennis, because I liked Dennis's music. I liked what he did. But I realized it was something more than that. And I remember one day in the middle of a song, people began to clap right in the middle of the song, and some were cheering, and I thought, that doesn't happen in my Baptist church in the middle of a song. And I looked up, and we were singing a Martin Luther hymn, Mighty Fortress is Our God. And he was saying something in there. It was a line about our ancient foe, one little word shall fell him. And we sang that, people just go, yes! Now, they're really paying attention to what they're singing. And my wife and I had the same experience about the second or third day. And it was that, I think I know what it is. Here are 800 people, and they know what God's done for them. They know He's set them free, and they know He's all they have. And we both sense the Lord saying, and I've done just as much for you. You're just not as aware or grateful as they are. And it really changed my heart on the whole approach to worship during that time as well. One of the things that I did not understand when I began going there was anything about the roots of homosexuality. In my mind, I just had the idea people are homosexual because they want to be. And if they don't want to be, they don't have to be. And I had no idea. I had no idea of the roots of the confusion, in many cases, the abuse, all the other things. I had no idea about any of that. And that was an eye-opener. And I've thought about it a lot of times since then. I'll still hear guys say occasionally to me, well, Bob, you know, it's just a choice. And I try to be careful. I don't want to offend, but I say to them, well, sin is always a choice, but temptation isn't. You don't get to choose what you're tempted by usually. And I said, many of these people have been abused, and they didn't choose that. They didn't choose to be abused. They didn't choose to go through the things they went through as children. So I think it's a cruel thing to say to people, it's just a choice. I began to go to Living Hope Ministries in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Someone at the conference, Brad Sargent, had plugged me into them and introduced me to them, and they'd invited me to visit, and I really thought, well, I'll visit a couple of times, kind of get an idea. But I got totally involved, and eventually was asked to serve on the board and have been on the board ever since that time. And going to the groups every week and listening to people tell their stories and listening to what they were going through was, I've said many times, it was almost the equivalent of another seminary education to go and listen and talk to these men and women week after week. So many of the cases were cases where there was some kind of break in the relationship with their father. And it may not have been a deliberate or a break of anger. It may have just been a disconnect. And I think one of the things that fathers do, if their male child is interested in arts, for instance, if they're interested in theater or music, they just sort of unconsciously shuffle it off to the mother or the church. And they think, I don't understand that, I don't relate to that, so I'm going to do my thing and he will do his thing. And so they disconnect. And that's the last thing they need to do. We tell parents a lot through our ministry, when we send missionaries onto a foreign field, we require two things in particular. They have to learn the culture and they have to learn the language. And your kids are the most important mission field you'll ever have. And it's your responsibility to learn them, not theirs to learn you. And so you have to get involved in that kid's life. Know what's driving him, what his thoughts and his ambitions and so forth are. And when the child's interest is different, the father will tend to pull away. And he needs to move in and not move away. So I see it can be through just being busy in business. It can be emotional disconnect. It can be physical abuse. And do not realize what that's doing to the psyche of that child. I would sit and listen to kids and be amazed at how many of them had been sexually abused, and oftentimes by someone they knew. And they didn't know how to process that. I've heard girls say, for instance, that when a male did that to them, it made them just turn away from males. They never wanted to be in that kind of relationship with a male again. And it really did things to them in the deep parts of their heart, in their life, and made them not want to have anything to do with men. And I know in some cases, I have a good friend of mine who talked about her father being very abusive to the mother. And in her mind, first of all, made her angry at men, but it also made her think, I don't want to be a woman because they're weak. And so I would rather be a man. And so there were so many things like this that I had no idea about those things being part of the root. And I saw the same thing with male children, that if the father was abusive to the mother, their attitude was, if that's what a man is, I don't want to be one. And so they would cut off that male part of their psyche because they didn't want to be what they saw in their father. And it was just, it's so tragic because so many of the things that happen in families that we don't realize how it's impacting a child, especially a sensitive child. We would try to plug them in to healthy same-sex relationships. And they would find in those relationships something that met that deep longing in their heart. And they had always tried to meet it before sexually because that was an easy way to get that connection. And in a culture that's as sexually broken as our culture is, they could find that. But it still was not what they were longing for. And when they began to establish that relationship with God and then find those healthy same-sex relationships in the context of the church, that need began to be ministered to, and they would find that sexual demand lessening. There is a longing in your heart that nothing but God will ever be able to fulfill. Nothing else is going to satisfy that. And one of the things that I would say to them is, until you come to a place where God is enough, no person is ever going to be enough. One of the things that I heard over and over in groups were men and women who had been wounded by the church. Not necessarily in intentional or hard ways, but just by not paying attention, not understanding what people were going through. And I remember talking with a guy in a group once, and he was telling me about being involved in gay activism, marching in the parades, and just really sensed God speaking to him one day, saying, you don't have to do this, I can set you free. And I thought he was going to say he thought about it, or prayed about it, whatever. He said, but I just laid my sign down and walked off and began to look for a church because I didn't know anything about Christianity. So he said, the first church you went to, he said, one of the first things the pastor said was, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And he said, and it just wounded me. And he said, so I left and thought, well, there's no answer here. And when he said that, I kind of cringed because while I had never said that from the pulpit, I had said it and thought it was pretty clever. And I had a pastor ask me recently, he said, well, Bob, that is true. And I said, well, yeah, it's true, but when you're someone who is struggling with that issue, to hear that come, what it says to you, I won't find any support and any compassion here. And so he fortunately found another church where they were more open to helping him. And so I began to see where a lot of the things I had said and done through the years had inflicted pain and had actually had people struggling with it, hurt it, would have turned them away. And so then I would hear them tell week after week things that their pastor or Christian leader had said. And sometimes it can be the most innocent thing. I had a guy in my group who was a successful executive in another part of the state. And he was telling me his story. And he said he had finally worked up the nerve to go and talk to an associate pastor. This man was probably in his 30s, and he had never acted on this, but he had struggled with it all of his life. And he said when he talked to the associate pastor, he was very warm, very kind, and just, told him he'd pray for him and so forth. But he said from that day, he never came back to me. He never said, hey, I've looked into this. I've found something that will help. He said, actually, if he saw me coming in the hall, he would turn and go another way. And so this man resigned his job as an executive, moved to Dallas-Fort Worth, got a part-time job so he could go through Living Hope Ministries. He so wanted to be free. But in his church, he had not found that. So I just continued to be burdened by that, and I formed a group at Exodus of Southern Baptists who were involved in Exodus, and began to talk to them about things they could do in their churches and so forth. And so then Tim Wilkins and I had talked, and we decided that we would go to the Southern Baptist Convention in 2001 and make some motions on the convention floor. And my motion was to encourage the convention to establish a task force, to encourage our people, to educate them, to encourage them to be proactive and redemptive in reaching out to those who struggle with unwanted same-sex attraction. And I was trying, even in the motion, to educate people, to make them aware that many of the people that we're looking at and talking about have unwanted same-sex attraction. They don't want this, but they don't know how to get out of it. And I was amazed and thrilled that the convention acted on this. And Dr. Jimmy Draper was president of Lifeway at the time, and he set about establishing a task force and invited some of us to serve on it. And we began to meet regularly with the convention leadership to talk about what can we do to help our churches. And then in 2005, they asked me to go and make another motion to establish an office of gender issues for the convention. And I did so, and then I was offered that position and have served in that since 2007. And the focus of it is to try to get into our churches, our educational institutions, to help them know some of these intricacies of ministering in this and what they can do to help people who struggle with this, and to make their church a place that has a sense of acceptance and warmth toward people who struggle, that they can find help to get out of that, where we don't close the door before they actually get there. Sometimes when I've talked to churches, they want to know, what do we need to do? And one of the things I tell them is, I said, I read an article some years ago about an architect in a major city who was being criticized by the Americans with Disabilities because his buildings were not handicap friendly. And he couldn't understand what they were saying. And he told them, he said, I go by the code. Every one of my buildings is by code. I follow all the guidelines. And so what they did was they took him to one of his buildings and put him in a wheelchair and said, now go through your building. And when he came back, he said, okay, now I understand what you mean. Then he saw. So I tell guys, you need to establish a relationship with someone who has struggled with this, someone who's come out of this, and allow them to talk to you, allow them to give you input, allow you to see what they have experienced and what can be different. So you can go through your church with different eyes to hear the things that people say in Sunday school classes. And I had a father tell me one time when I had said that, he said, I used to sit in on those. He said, and I didn't say a lot. He said, but I laughed. And he said, but after my son told me about his struggle, he said, it wasn't funny anymore. And now when I hear that, he said, it's just so painful. So I try to help guys understand what to look for, how to help your people be more sensitive in dealing with people who struggle with this, because many times you don't know who they are. I was asked to come to a church in our area, fairly large, because one of their laymen had said that he was leaving his wife and children for a man. They want to know how to deal with it. And so I talked to them about several things. And when I talked to them about, I said, have you thought about the special ministry the wife is going to need? And they said, well, no, we've just been kind of focused on him. And I said, well, she and those kids are going to have a lot of special needs, and you need to be aware of that. And so as we were talking, I said to them, our church every year has Living Hope Ministries come out and share testimonies and tell a little about the ministry. And one of them looked at me and said, you mean in the main service? And I said, well, that's where the people are. And that's where they need to hear it. I said, because I'll tell you something, this church of about 1,000 people. I said, a lot of people are watching this situation to see what you're going to do. And maybe not even homosexual strugglers, but people who struggle with other things, they were going to know, how is this church going to handle this? And I said, and there are other people out there who struggle with homosexuality. They're going to want to know, what are you going to do? And I saw him kind of draw back, like, no. And I said, but see, you didn't know about this guy until he told you. And there are others out there that you don't know about. And they're going to be watching you to see Is this a safe place where I can share my struggle? So I talked to them about being conscious of what it looks like from that side, because that's what I heard and saw over and over again in sitting and listening to men and women talk, and even in hearing testimonies at conferences. I would hear people talk about things that were said and done that wounded them. And, you know, I might not think anything about that, but then that's not my area of struggle, and I didn't have that kind of sensitivity of spirit that they did. There are some very strong ministries around the country that offer teaching. They will send people to your church to walk with you, to talk to you, to set up conferences. Joe Dallas has written some great books. He's got one book that's an overall book, The Complete Christian Guide to Understanding Homosexuality. And one of the things that I always recommend to pastors, especially, is to get Robert Gagnon's books. I don't know of anything. Joe does some things that are more popular treatment, and they're great. But if you really want to get into more detail, to be more prepared to deal with gay apologists, I don't know of anything better than Robert Gagnon's books to help with that. If we come to a place as a church where we try to convince ourselves that this is not sin, that it's not wrong, then we have undermined the authority of Scripture. We have eroded the power of Scripture. And so then we've lost that weapon, we've lost that tool, and it's going to erode other areas. Secondly, if we do not handle it in a compassionate and redemptive way, there will come a time in this culture where people will look at us as bigots and haters, and they won't want to hear what we have to say. And I think we have seen that happen in recent years, where this has successfully been the picture painted to the world, that the church who speaks against this is just hate-filled. So I think the church has to do two things. They have to look at this as a multifaceted situation. They have to look at the family dynamics. They have to look at the person who struggles. They have to look at the family members who are affected, and help them not only know how to deal with it emotionally and spiritually, but how to deal with it relationally with their child who struggles. And honestly, I don't think, by and large, we're equipped very well to do those things. That is so critical. I think we have to look at prevention, helping our parents know when kids are very young, what do we need to put into that kid's life? So to understand a lot of things about training children in their gender identity while they're young, so they understand what makes them a man, what makes them a woman. The whole issue of gender and the whole issue of training children in the Lord, I think is the biggest challenge we're facing in our culture today.